Okay, so we've checked the brakes, we've changed the brake fluid, we've checked the alignment and the suspension, we've changed the engine oil and filter and the front and rear axle oil. Last thing we've got to do here service-wise is adjust or check the valve gap. So to do that, basically the biggest part of that job is getting at the top of the engine head. Tank cover here is held in place by several of these plastic push pins. Basically you pry the centerpiece back about 1/4 of an inch and the whole pin then will pull out of the hole. Anybody that owns these is, I'm sure, familiar with these little Honda push clips. Their purpose, of course, if you smack a tree or something, they'll pop through the hole without ripping up the plastic panels like it would if there was a bolt. Anyway, there's one on each corner of this center section. There's I think it's a 10mm bolt there on both side covers. Another one down here. There's one up in the corner here, one up here. There's some tabs here that engage in the fender. Along on the other side there, another push clip. Another one right under there. Another one here and another bolt. And we'll go ahead and get the gas tank cover off. Then next we'll take the gas tank and we'll end up taking the heat shield and the plumbing for the intake snorkel out and get us to the engine head. Okay, a little bit of cursing and some spring clips later, and there's the tank cover. Can be kind of frustrating if you haven't done them before. To get a shot of, you can see that tab there. That's kind of how it locks to the fenders. You have to shove it forward. The front end of the centerpiece there is screwed to the side panels, but you can kind of shove the panels against each other and unhook those two little clips to help you get this thing up and off the tank. Then the other thing I've taken off is the lower shroud here. It has a rubber clip that clips to the bottom of that piece on the tank cover. Two little pieces there that clip to the inner fender, and then there's a screw that clips it down at the bottom of the floorboard. So that leaves the ATV looking like this. So it gives us access to the fuel tank. The reason I pulled this lower cover is there's a clutch adjustment. I can handle both of these with one hand. Right there. Basically, these auto clutch 5-speeds have two clutch systems. One is a centrifugal clutch that resides under the front cover here. It's basically a drum shaped clutch with some weights on the inside that are held in with springs and have friction material on the outside edge, so that when the engine RPM comes up above idle, it starts to drive the machine forward. And in the center of that hub is a Sprague drive, or like a one-way drive, like a ratchet. And that allows you to have engine holdback going down hills even when the engine's at idle speed. And then the second clutch, which that adjustment is for, is called the change clutch. It's very similar to a typical motorcycle clutch with a basket of friction plates with clutch material on it and clutch plates, metal clutch plates. And what that does is whenever the shift lever is a little bit out of the center detent, it disengages and allows you to complete the shift. So the adjustment there keeps the clutch from slipping if there's not enough play, or if there's too much play, then when you push the shifter you'd start trying to move gears against each other before that clutch is released. In other words, they'd still be under pressure and that'd make them difficult to shift. Anyway, essentially there's a screw shaft there in the middle and a lock nut, and you'd undo the lock nut there, and then you'd turn the center screw there one turn clockwise. Then you'd slowly turn it counterclockwise until you feel resistance when the plunger hits the end of the clutch, and then you'd back it off about a quarter turn clockwise, and then lock that nut at 22 Newton meters. I actually had that adjustment plunger seize in that front cover. I actually got corroded in there, and actually had to take the front cover off and press it out of that case, and went ahead and replaced it and greased it up good, so that's something we can bind up. Anyway, where we're at here is taking the tank off. It's secured by two rubber straps on either side of the back, and then up under the steering column here are I think they're two 12 millimeter, I believe, bolts. Then you see the fuel level sensor for the gas gauge has wiring along clipped in two places there, and it runs to a 2-pin connector up there. So once we get the tank shuffled back, we'll pluck that wire out of those two holders there and reach back in there and disconnect that connector. The other thing, when I park the machine here, I shut the fuel off and I let it run itself out, and that way I won't have so much gas going on when I disconnect the fuel line. The other thing you can do if you didn't do that is shut the gas off, and actually the other side of the carburetor there's a drain screw. Hopefully you can see it there, right basically directly below the idle adjustment knob there is a drain screw. One thing with these things, when people have difficulty starting them, especially in the winter and especially after they've been sitting, gas goes stale fastest in small quantities, like in the carb float bowl, where it's exposed to air. And you'll find if you crack that drain valve and let the stale gas out and turn the gas back on, it'll generally solve that problem. Or to prevent it from happening, shut the gas off when you park it and let it run the float bowl out, and you'll find it'll fire up much more easily when you go to use it again. Anyway, so we're going to pull this intake plumbing out of here too, and it is basically this rubber flap has a couple of those spring clips on it too. We'll get those out of the way, and down in there is a hose clamp securing it where it goes through the air box, and might not be a very good view, but you can access the screw head for that band right there. So I'll go ahead and get this stuff out of the way. Okay, here's what the intake piece looks like. You just undo that band clamp and kind of twist it and plunk it out. And here's the little rubber heat shield that sits underneath it. Oh, also on this there's a little plastic Phillips screw that attaches to a heat shield here, and you kind of need to reach under there and hold the nut part of it as you unscrew that, and that pops out. Then I've went ahead and unhooked the fuel line from the carburetor there. You want to have a rag handy in case you get a couple drops of gas. Also, of course, a general practice in the garage is to have a fire extinguisher around and an eye wash station. Anyway, I've went ahead and slid the gas tank back, and I wanted to show you guys the that red 2-pin connector there. You can see has a little release tab right on the bottom of it. I'll go ahead and poke that and disconnect the gas gauge sending unit, and we'll be able to take the gas tank off and set it out of the way. Okay, although the Foreman doesn't have a fuel filter per se, under the The underside of the tank here, there are two bolts that hold the petcock on, and if you pull those out and draw that out, there's a fine screen there that needs to be periodically sprayed off and cleaned. Okay, here's what we have with the fuel tank removed. This heat shield thing, some rubber flaps that are just clipped into little slots there. Then it's got two pins that engage brackets in the frame. You can just squeeze those out of the way. And then we've got the throttle cable and the enricher cable running to the carburetor here. It's a good time to check the operation of the enricher and make sure it moves its full range of motion, doesn't bind up. Also, one thing folks sometimes have problems with having the quad not stay running when they're trying to warm it up in cold weather, and the choke knob will vibrate its way back in. If you grab the round part of that housing and twist it, you can actually adjust the amount of friction on that. And then our throttle, we want a little bit of free play, and when we push it all the way forward, you can see it moves smooth and doesn't bind up. So anyway, the next step will be to just unclip these cables here, unhook the flap, this rubber flap here where it clips on, and squeeze that out of its connectors there. Looks like I've got one other little wiring clip there to undo, and take this piece out and we'll finally be at the top of the engine. Okay, here is the elusive top of the motor. I mentioned that most of the work was getting all the body work and stuff off. So now what we need to do is clean the dust off around these two caps, which I've already done, and pull down. It's a good time if you want to inspect your spark plug or change it to pull that. Before you take the spark plug out, they'll blow some compressed air around there. You don't want any dust or little particles or anything getting into the cylinder there. It'll cause wear. So we'll do that, and then over here on the other side of the engine, we're going to need a 6mm Allen wrench, and we'll be pulling down here next to the starter rope. You see that Allen headed screw there? That's the inspection hole to see the flywheel. And once we've got that done, what we'll be doing is using the pull starter to turn the engine very slowly until you see a little T etched in the flywheel through that window. That indicates that the piston is at top dead center. Remember, this is a 4-stroke though, and so basically you've got an intake stroke coming down, a compression stroke going up, a power stroke going back down, and an exhaust stroke going back up. So if we get a T in there, and then we'll grab onto these rocker arms and see if there's any play. If there's no play in either rocker arm, what it means is the engine is top dead center between the exhaust and the intake stroke, and the valves are both slightly open as they overlap in that phase. So that's not where we want the engine to adjust the valves. It's one of the mistakes sometimes budding mechanics make. If that's the case, if both of those have no play, we'll turn the engine another full rotation until the piston goes back down and back up to top dead center, and then there should be play in both rocker arms. And that's because the engine will be top dead center between the compression and the power stroke where the valves are fully closed. And that's where we want it to inspect the clearance at the valves. Okay, here's a little shot of those caps. We'll go ahead and make sure the O-rings there are in good shape, and if there's any doubt, we'll replace them. And next to it is the little Allen-headed plug. The O-ring for that stayed in the engine. It looks to be in good shape. And I've went ahead and pulled it around until I got my little T on the flywheel. With the spark plug in, you'll find you'll need to pull it quite slowly. Otherwise, compression will build up as it piston goes up and push you past where you want to be. And manipulate a light on this camera at the same time. Stay. There you can see the exhaust valve, and there's play in both of them, which tells me I've got this in the condition I need it to be in to check the valves. Spec on these is 0.15 millimeter for both the intake and the exhaust, which comes out to about 0.006, 0.006 of an inch. When you get a feeler gauge in there to check the valve gap, it's important that the gauge blade be in the same plane as the end of the valve. That way you can feel for the proper amount of resistance. If you get it in there at a funky some other angle, you won't be able to feel the drag on it properly. So we'll slip our feeler gauge in there, and that slides through there pretty easily, so that one's a little bit loose. Well, it's tough to do this with one hand holding the camera. And probably can't see that very well, but ditto with the intake, that slides pretty easily. So we'll go ahead and take a screwdriver and hold the adjusting the stem itself steady and a 10 millimeter wrench, and break that adjusting nut free. We'll snug it down a little bit, snug that nut kind of by feel for torque, and make sure we've got it where we want it. Then we'll take our torque wrench, and the valve adjusting nuts require 17 Newton meters. So once I've got it where I think I need it, I'll torque those nuts, and then I'll recheck again with my feeler gauge and make sure it hasn't changed. And I want to, the gauge should slip in there without much difficulty and pull through that gap with just a little bit of resistance, and then I'll know I've got the valves set right where they should be. Okay, a little dinking around and got the valve snugged up, and tightened the lock nuts to 17 Newton meters, and see I've got just a nice little bit of drag in that valve gap with the feeler gauge, which is just where I want them. So it'll be a matter of buttoning things up now. I think I forgot to mention earlier that to set the valves on the engine, you need the engine to be exactly stone cold. So it's sat quite a while since we had it running to circulate the oil to drain it, and everything looks good to go. So basically assembly will be the reverse of disassembly. Okay, we'll talk about our last step here to finish things up. On these Foremans, pressing and holding the auto trip button and reset at the same time is how you reset the service reminder. If the service reminder hasn't come on yet, like it hasn't in my machine, when you poke these buttons, it'll blink on like that to confirm that you've reset it. The fuel gauge is freaking out there because I don't have the gas tank back on. Okay, that pretty much wraps up most of the routine maintenance you need to do on a Honda Foreman. These things are incredibly tough machines, and stone axe simple, so they really can take a beating. Mine sure has, without causing any problems. However, like any machine, you've got to take care of it and do some maintenance, particularly looking at the suspension and the tie rod ends and that sort of stuff, and brakes, of course, are directly related to safety. Anyway, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for some more mechanical project videos as the opportunity comes up.